Welcome to fourth grade history. So this is our lesson on the civil rights movement in Alabama for our fourth grade Alabama history video. So this is an important standard that we're going to teach during this video. And some of the standards that we're going to talk about are knowing how the civil rights movement changed Alabama. So some of the vocabulary that we're going to talk about during this class is civil rights, discrimination, desegregate, boycott, sit-ins, freedom rides, integration, and suffrage. So the civil rights movement started some during the 1950s and 1960s. And this is when Americans began to speak out against the discrimination. And discrimination just means the unfair treatment. Our civil rights are our freedoms that are guaranteed by the Constitution for everybody in the United States. And there were some key events that happened in Alabama. Some major players in the civil rights movement. Although many African Americans had served their country in World War II, they did not have the same civil rights as other Americans. Civil rights are, our freedoms that are guaranteed for all U.S. citizens. So Rosa Parks and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. were both important players in the civil rights movement. I am going to give you a link for the Kid President video about the story of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It's a really awesome story that he has made. So in 1896, the Supreme Court ruled in Plessy versus Ferguson on the segregation or separation of public places by race. So places could be separate, but were also supposed to be equal. Yet often they were not equal. And Alabama's government took additional steps against African Americans. So in 1901, the state constitution was rewritten. And it created many obstacles that made it almost impossible for African Americans to vote. Some white Alabamians also used violence to keep African Americans from voting. It was a very, very sad time in Alabama history. African Americans felt the effects of segregation for decades. They experienced inequality in education and work, as well as discrimination in public places, including the buses and restrooms. There was a Supreme Court case to help challenge the segregation. So it was called Brown versus Board of Education. And it compared the quality of public schools for African Americans with public schools for white students. And the Supreme Court found that the schools were unequal, and African American schools had less money. So segregation labeled these African American children as inferior, which was untrue and damaging. The Supreme Court said that this kept the African American children from getting a good education. It said that separate schools could not be equal. So on May 17th, 1954, the Supreme Court ruled to desegregate or stop separating by race all schools in the nation. So this was an important, very, very important for the whole country. They all had to start going to not being separate schools. Very, very important date for that. Some people did not agree with that. They wanted schools to stay separate. And Alabama's governor at the time, George C. Wallace, was among them. He tried to stop African American students from going to classes at the University of Alabama in 1963. So I want you to be thinking about how school desegregation during the 1950s, think about it, and predict how you think it would affect African American students. Now, we did have the Montgomery bus boycott. So this was another important step, and it happened in Alabama. In 1955, a woman named Rosa Parks stood up against an Alabama law that required African Americans to give up seats towards the front of a bus if a white person wanted them and move to the back of the bus. One day, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat for a white person, and she was arrested. So the Montgomery bus boycott was held in response to her arrest. So a boycott is a refusal by a large group of people to buy goods from or use services of a certain business. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a leader of the civil rights movement, he led that boycott. And Dr. King encouraged nonviolence or peaceful protesting as the way to gain civil rights. So this started in December 1955, and it lasted 381 days. So it didn't end until Alabama Judge Frank M. Johnson Jr. ruled that that bus segregation law was illegal. So Rosa Parks was really important in Alabama in fighting for the civil rights. She stood up by attending meetings, rallies, and marches. The result of Mrs. Parks getting off the bus was the Montgomery bus boycott. The boycott was effective because it helped desegregate buses in America. She's considered to be a hero because she helped end segregation in the US. And just remember that Rosa Parks was a seamstress. And her and Dr. King both wanted peaceful protests and marches. They didn't want war. They didn't want fighting to be involved with it. In January 1957, the success of the boycott was met with violence. The home and church of another civil rights leader, Ralph David Abernathy, were bombed. So in August 1957, Abernathy, King, and other civil rights leaders started the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. It would become one of the strongest civil rights organizations in the South. And here's that awesome saying by Miss Rosa Parks. She said, "I felt it was not right to be deprived of freedom." And it was not right. She had a right just like anybody else to sit at the front of the bus. So there were sit-ins and freedom rides. The civil rights movement continued to grow, and people used nonviolent methods to protest. So some of these were called sit-ins. And so the African Americans sat down in the places that they were not welcome at and refused to leave. In 1961, mixed groups of African Americans and white people began taking bus rides through the South. They called these trips freedom rides. So in 1960, segregation on interstate buses became illegal. The Freedom Riders wanted to test this desegregation law to see if riders were treated fairly. In Alabama, Freedom Riders were often violently attacked. John Lewis, an African-American college student from Pikes County, Alabama, was inspired by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He organized sit-ins and freedom rides. Lewis soon became a leader of the student civil rights movement. So Birmingham was also another important area for the civil rights movement in Alabama. And there it was led by Fred Shuttlesworth, and he was the pastor of Bethel Baptist Church. And he started a group called the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights. And he invited the SCLC that Dr. King and them were a part of to come to Birmingham too, to work together to protest segregation. And the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham was often a meeting place for these civil rights workers. And on September 15th, 1963, the church was bombed. 4 young girls died. People across the nation learned about the tragedy, and they were sad and angry. The church bombing in Birmingham had a huge effect on the civil rights movement. Dr. King and other civil rights leaders were even more determined to gain equal rights for African Americans. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was proposed by our president at the time, John F. Kennedy. And if the bill became law, then segregation would become illegal throughout the country. In August of 1963 is when Dr. Martin Luther King led a march to Washington, D.C., with about 200,000 protesters gathered in front of the Lincoln Memorial. That was when Dr. King gave his most famous speech that we know as the I Have a Dream speech. This cry put an end to unfair treatment that the government could not ignore. After a strong debate, the Civil Rights Bill passed, and President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the bill into law in July 1964. It made it illegal discrimination based on race, skin color, religion, or place of birth. This act also said that the federal government could enforce desegregation of public places. So that said that the public schools had to desegregate. So they had to let other students come to their schools. So during this time, there was also another leader in the civil rights movement named Malcolm X. And Malcolm X talked to African Americans about having pride in themselves. He was also interested in civil rights, but he did not agree with the nonviolence method like Dr. King and Mrs. Parks. For many years, he told people to defend themselves by any means necessary. Eventually, though, he adopted Dr. King's policy of nonviolence. They were very different leaders, but they both fought for the same thing, equality. So after the civil rights movement started and they got desegregation and the Civil Rights Act was passed, then the leaders of the civil rights movement started focusing on the suffrage, American suffrage, which means the right to vote. The word suffrage is just a more formal way of saying the right to vote. And they wanted to be able to vote in elections. So in March 1965, Dr. King organized a protest march from Selma to Montgomery. John Lewis was the leader, and there was about 600 protesters, but they were blocked by the Alabama State Police. This event became known as Bloody Sunday. Dr. King and his supporters marched twice more. He led 2,500 marchers on March 9th, 1965, and then 3 weeks later, led about 8,000 from Selma. So federal troops also walked alongside the marchers so that no one would get hurt. And as the protesters walked, more people were joined. It grew to about 20,000 people before they arrived in Montgomery. The march brought national attention to the voting rights issue. So after this march, the federal government gave stronger support to civil rights. And in 1965, they passed the Voting Rights Act. And this protected the voting rights of all Americans. So African Americans were finally allowed to vote in Alabama and the rest of the United States. And soon the African Americans began to gain power in the government. The civil rights movement changed Alabama and the nation. It ended a century of segregation. It created new opportunities for African Americans and inspired people to stop discrimination and teach togetherness. So I want you to think about what we read about. There we go. And I want you to think about what the main idea was about what we read today and come up with some details that we talked about, that was talked about during the lesson about African Americans fighting for equal rights. And then I want you to think about how Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X are similar and how they're different. And I want you to talk to your learning coaches about it and tell them what you learned about the two leaders of the civil rights movement. And I want you to tell them and explain how individuals influence the goals of government during the civil rights movement. tell your learning coach some of those details and some of those similarities and differences. I hope you have a great day.